All right. So, very first thing you need to learn when you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh is where you're playing. So, the board in front of you is basically what you're going to be playing with, and you won't always have a board to play with if you're playing in real life. So, it's always good to remember in your head where they are. So, we're going to start with the main monster zone. The main monster zone is where you put all your monsters from the main deck and some from the extra deck, and this is where you're going to summon, special summon, and so on throughout your turn, but for monsters mainly. Under it, you have the spell and trap zone and two pendulum zones, which are also considered spell and trap zones, so don't get them confused. For the purposes of this video, just consider all five of them spell and trap zones. And pendulum zones, I'll go over a little more in detail in another video as they need a video all to themselves. So spell trap zones are only for, as stated, spell and trap cards, unless certain exceptions apply. So some monsters can be placed on the spell and trap zone, but that's an exception. Don't worry too much about that. Stick to what the main purpose and the main cards that go in these zones are. I'll go over in future videos which cards go where. So it makes it easier to understand how these go through. For now, just understand the board that's in front of you. On the left-hand side, you have the extra deck, which will have your extra deck monsters, which I'll go in depth on another video what they are. Above that is the field zone. Typically a spell card, a field spell card will go over there, which usually yeah, it just goes there and usually has some exceptions to it as I'll go over in another video. On top of that is a side deck. If you're someone who plays very casually and just plays for fun, you don't have to worry too much about this zone because the side deck is 15 cards that you can interchange within your deck. But it's done between games and mainly done during competitive play or if you're playing with somebody who wants to use their side deck. Next, you have the extra monster zone, which is used for extra deck monsters only. So you cannot put a monster from your main deck onto an extra monster zone. It's only for extra deck monsters and becomes a lot more relevant when we talk about link monsters. Banish zone is for cards that for banished. Banished are completely out of play and it's a little more definite than just going to the graveyard. They're a little bit harder to interact with and very specific decks and cards interact with this zone, but it's important to remember that this zone exists because when a card is banished, it's very different than being in the graveyard. Now, the graveyard is is the zone where most of your cards are going to go. After they've been used or destroyed, they go into the graveyard. So for example, if you play a spell and it's already resolved, it will go into the graveyard. And that's basically what it is. It's mainly for all the cards that have been used or destroyed. Your main deck. Your main deck was basically exactly as it sounds. Your main deck has all your monsters, your spells, and your traps, your main monsters. It can have 40 to 60 cards, but must have 40 cards in it, minimum. And then 60 cards is the maximum. Any more than 60, and you're basically cheating. It's always going to be on the right hand side, and your extra deck always be on the left hand side. And so just keep that in mind when you're playing and when you're building a deck, so you don't build a deck with less than 40 or more than 60. So as we go through, I'll continue going in more detail with each zone or each card or whatever needs to be done. But for now, just bare bones, look at this and understand what each zone is based on what was stated. Just very, very briefly.